Hello and welcome back to Psych Ed. This video is going to be focusing on the Stanford prison experiment run by the somewhat notorious Philip Zimbardo, who, unlike most of the people who I talk about on these videos, is actually still alive, which is a nice change. Zimbardo and his colleagues in 1973 were interested in finding out whether the brutality reported among guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personalities of the guards, or had more to do with the prison environment. For example, prisoners and guards may have personalities which make conflict inevitable, with prisoners lacking respect for law and order, and guards being domineering and often aggressive. That would be an example of a dispositional reason. Alternatively, prisoners and guards may behave in a hostile manner due to the rigid power structure of the social environment in prisons. That would be an example of a situational factor. Zimbardo predicted that the situation made people act the way they do rather than their disposition. To study the roles people play in prison situations, Zimbardo converted a basement of the Stanford University psychology building into a mock prison. He advertised asking for volunteers to participate in a study of the psychological effects of prison life. The 75 applicants who answered the advert were given diagnostic interviews and personality tests to eliminate candidates with psychological problems, medical disabilities, or a history of crime or drug abuse. 24 men, judged to be the most physically and mentally fit and stable, the most mature, and the least involved in antisocial behaviors, were chosen to participate. Participants did not know each other prior to the study, and they were paid a relatively decent fee of $15 per day to take part in the experiment. Remember, this was 1973, and it's a psychology research experiment, so not a huge amount of money to go around. Participants were randomly assigned to either the role of a prisoner or a guard in a simulated prison environment. There were 2 reserves, and 1 dropped out, finally leaving 10 prisoners and 11 guards. So perhaps as the first sign of an imbalance, a power shift towards the guards. It might be a kind of foreshadowing of what came later. But the prisoners were treated like every other criminal. They were arrested at their own homes, which, by the way, they didn't know was actually going to happen, and then taken to the local police station. They were then fingerprinted, photographed, and booked in. They were then blindfolded and driven to the psychology department of Stanford University, where Zimbardo had had the basement set out before. Doors and windows were barred, the walls were bare, and the cells were quite small, and herein began the de-individuation process. When the prisoners arrived at the prison, they were stripped naked, deloused, had all of their personal possessions removed and locked away, and were given prison clothes and bedding. They were issued a uniform and referred to by only a number. The use of ID numbers here was a way to make prisoners anonymous in terms of data collection. Each prisoner had to be called only by his ID name and could only refer to himself and others by their numbers. However, this also starts to strip away at what makes individuals individuals, as opposed to just being anonymous numbers. Their clothes comprised of a smock with their number written on it, but no underclothes. They also had a tight nylon cap to cover their hair and a locked chain around one ankle. All guards were dressed in identical uniforms of khaki, and they carried a whistle around their neck and a billy club borrowed from the police. Guards also wore special sunglasses to make eye contact with prisoners impossible. 3 guards worked the shift of 8 hours each. The other guards remained on call. Guards were instructed to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain law and order in the prison and to command the respect of the prisoners. However, no physical violence was permitted. Zimbardo observed the behavior of the prisoners and guards as a researcher, but he also acted as the prison warden. Within a relatively short time, both the guards and the prisoners were settling into their new roles. Within hours of beginning the experiment, some guards began to harass prisoners. At around 2:30 a.m., prisoners were awakened from sleep by blasting whistles for the first of many counts. The counts served as a way of familiarizing the prisoners with their numbers. More importantly, it also provided a regular occasion for the guards to exercise control over the prisoners. The prisoners soon adopted prisoner-like behavior as well. They talked about prison issues a great deal of the time. They told tale on each other to the guards. They started taking the prison rules very seriously, as though they were there for the prisoners' benefit. An infringement would spell disaster for all of them. Some even began siding with the guards against prisoners who did not obey the rules. The prisoners were taunted with insults and petty orders, they were given pointless and boring tasks to accomplish, and they were generally dehumanized by the guards. Push-ups were a common form of physical punishment imposed by the guards. All of this happened on the first day, which passed without incident. And thus the guards were surprised and totally unprepared for the rebellion which broke out on the morning of the second day. On the second day, the prisoners removed their stocking caps, ripped off their numbers, and barricaded themselves inside the cells by putting their beds against the door. The guards called in reinforcements when this occurred. The 3 guards who were waiting on standby duty came in, and the night shift guards voluntarily remained on duty. To put down the rebellion, the guards retaliated by using a fire extinguisher and shooting at the prisoners to force them away from the doors. Next, the guards broke into each cell, stripped the prisoners naked, and took out the beds. The ringleaders of the prison rebellion were placed into solitary confinement, and after this, the guards generally began to harass and intimidate the prisoners to a greater extent. One of the 3 cells was assigned as a privileged cell. The 3 prisoners least involved in the rebellion were given special privileges. The guards gave them back their uniforms and beds and allowed them to wash their hair and brush their teeth. Privileged prisoners also got to eat special food in the presence of the other prisoners who had temporarily lost the privilege of eating. The effect was here to break solidarity among the prisoners. If the prisoners are fractured, then they cannot team together to rebel against the guards. Over the next few days, the relationship between the guards and the prisoners changed, with a change in one leading to a change in the other. Remember that the guards were firmly in control and the prisoners were totally dependent on them. As the prisoners became more dependent, the guards became more derisive towards them. They held the prisoners in contempt and let the prisoners know it. As the guards' contempt for them grew, the prisoners became even more submissive. As the prisoner became more submissive, the guards became more aggressive and assertive. They demanded ever greater obedience from the prisoners. The prisoners were dependent on the guards for everything, and so they had to try and find ways to please the guards, such as telling tales on fellow prisoners. I suppose the colloquial term for that would be snitching. Less than a day and a half into the experiment, prisoner number 8612 began suffering from acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, and uncontrollable crying and rage. After meeting with the guards where they told him he was weak, but offered him informant status, prisoner 8612 returned to the other prisoners and said, "You can't leave. You can't quit." Soon, prisoner 8612 began to act crazy, to scream and to curse, to go into a rage that seemed out of control, as one of the other prisoners was quoted as saying. And it wasn't until this point that the psychologists realized that they had to let him out. The next day, the guards held a visiting hour for parents and friends. They were worried that when the parents saw the state of the jail, they might insist on taking their sons home. Guards now washed the prisoners, had them clean and fed them dinner, and played some music. After the visit, rumors spread of a mass escape plan. Afraid that they would lose the prisoners, the guards and experimenters tried to enlist the help and facilities of the Palo Alto Police Department. The guards again escalated the level of harassment, forcing the prisoners to do menial or repetitive work, such as cleaning the toilets with their bare hands. Zimbardo invited a Catholic who had previously been a prison chaplain to evaluate how realistic the prison situation was. Half of the prisoners introduced themselves by their number, rather than their name. The chaplain interviewed each prisoner individually. The priest told them that the only way that they would ever get out was with the help of a lawyer. While talking to the priest, one prisoner, prisoner number 819, broke down and began to cry hysterically, just as 2 previously released prisoners had. The psychologist removed the chain from his foot, the cap off his head, and told him to go and rest in the room that was adjacent to the prison yard. They told him that they would get him some food and they would take him to see a doctor. While this was going on, one of the guards lined up the other prisoners and had them chant loud, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner. Because of what prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess, Mr. Correction Officer." The psychologist realized prisoner 819 could hear the chanting and went back into the room where they found him sobbing uncontrollably. The psychologist tried to get him to agree to leave the experiment, but he said he could not leave because the others had labeled him a bad prisoner. At that point, Zimbardo, who had intended the experiment should run for 2 weeks, terminated the experiment due to the emotional breakdowns of prisoners and the excessive aggression of the guards. Zimbardo in 2008 later noted that it wasn't until much later that he realized how far into the prison role he got. He was thinking more like a prison superintendent or a warden rather than a research psychologist. According to Zimbardo and his colleagues, the Stanford prison experiment revealed how people will readily conform to the social roles that they are expected to play, even if the roles are as strongly stereotyped as those of a prison guard. Because the guards were placed in a position of authority, they began to act in ways that they would not usually behave in their normal lives. This was even further facilitated by the de-individuation process. Their identities were stripped away from their persons. The prison environment here was an important factor in creating the guards' brutal behavior. I mentioned earlier these prisoners were required to take personality tests and undergo assessment interviews to make sure that they had relatively stable mental traits. Therefore, the findings support the situational explanation of behavior rather than the dispositional one. It is the environment that causes individuals to act in certain ways and not necessarily an individual's personality. Zimbardo proposed that 2 processes can explain the prisoner's final submission. The first is the de-individuation process. This is a state where you become so immersed in the norms of the group that you lose your sense of identity as well as your sense of personal responsibility. The guards may have been so sadistic because they did not feel what happened was down to them personally. It was an established norm. They also might have lost their sense of personal identity because of the uniform they wore. Additionally, there is learned helplessness, which Zimbardo believed could explain the prisoners' submission to the guards. The prisoners learned that whatever they did had little effect on what happened to them. In the mock prison, the unpredictable decisions of the guards led the prisoners to give up responding. Now, while the study is notoriously unethical for what happened, one of the benefits that did derive from the unfortunate treatment of these participants is that it led to the formal recognition of ethical guidelines by the American Psychological Association, and that has been adopted throughout the academic world. Now studies from as low as undergraduate studies have to go under extensive review by either an institutional review board or an ethics committee before they are allowed to be implemented and go ahead with data collection. And that's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting. If you do, maybe give a like and subscribe, and check out some of the other videos. Thanks for watching.